Hi everyone, welcome to this exclusive interview with Hugo Rifkind. I'm Fiona Palmer, AJEX's Chief Executive. Mike Bluestone, our National Chairman, would be introducing this special event. However, sadly, Mike and his family are all down with COVID and we wish them a speedy recovery. This event is taking part as part of the exciting AJEX Our Duty is to Care campaign. This is our first ever 36-hour fundraising campaign and all donations are doubled by our generous matchers. We're asking people to help support our vital work in remembrance, education, welfare and combating anti-Semitism. So before we pass over to Hugo and Sydney Miller from JLGB, who will be interviewing him, here is our 2-minute campaign video.
AJEX is dedicated to the Jewish men and women who fought and still fight for our freedom and security.
Our duty at AJEX is to care, and we're immensely proud of our work in welfare, education, fighting anti-Semitism, and of course, remembrance.
We must never forget our obligation to confront the horrors of war. It is our obligation to honour the memory of those who served, especially at the time of the AJEX National Parade and Commemoration. This year will be the 100th anniversary of the first wreath laying by Jewish veterans at the cenotaph. We will always remember.
From the start of the 20th century to today, over 150,000 Jews have served.
Without help from AJEX, there are people who would have frozen during the winter, gone hungry, or even been homeless.
Every year, we commit thousands of pounds to relieving suffering in the Jewish veteran community.
My family have always said that we have a duty to pass down the story of the many Jewish people who served and gave their lives for us.
Amongst others, our educational initiatives reach out to thousands of Jewish and non-Jewish school children.
We play a vital role in a society that sadly still needs reminding that Jews are proud British citizens. Recent events have shown that is an understanding that we cannot take for granted.
AJEX was founded almost 100 years ago in response to ignorance and hatred. We are proud to combat anti-Semitism and show the Jewish role in modern Britain. We are proud to remember our heritage of military service. We are proud to share the history of Jewish servicemen and women. We are proud to be supporting those who rely on our help. We are proud to do our duty, but we can't do it without your help. Please do your bit and support us today.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sydney Miller and I'm JLGB's National Youth Representative. I'm delighted to be hosting a special edition of JLGB Virtual alongside our brilliant friends at AJEX as part of their Our Duty is to Care campaign by interviewing tonight's very special guest who joins us right now. It's journalist and presenter Hugo Rifkind. Welcome, Hugo. How are you this evening?
I'm very well, Sydney. Thanks for having me. Very nice to be here.
Glad. And how have you been coping throughout the pandemic so far?
Only went a bit mad at the start. Generally fine. I've been working right through, and I go into the office at least once a week. So it's been fairly normal. I'm normally a journalist who works at home a bit and in the office a bit, so that's not been so different, except for the way when I go to the office, no one else is there.
Of course. So if you don't mind, I'm going to start right back at the very beginning. So can you tell us about your childhood and what it was like growing up in Edinburgh in a small Jewish community? And is it true that you were the only Jew in your school?
Edinburgh did have a very small Jewish community, now has an even smaller Jewish community. It's a sort of odd anomaly because it's got quite a big shul. The shul was in part built by my great-grandfather. And when I was growing up in Edinburgh, there were perhaps 300 to 400 Jews in Edinburgh. There's now under 20, I'd say, or at least Orthodox Jews. At least members of the Orthodox community, I should say. My family was very closely intertwined with the Edinburgh Jewish community there. My father had, I think, 19 first cousins, and all their he was one of my grandfather was one of 10, so all of whom grew up in Marchmont in Edinburgh. And so their various descendants sort of spread around, mainly Scotland, bit of the north of England, So I didn't really know many Jews I wasn't related to until I went to university. So my experience of Judaism is a little bit strange, perhaps. But the Edinburgh community was small. My first school, George Watson's, there were other Jews there, but I was related to all of them except for maybe two, I think. The second school I went to was a school called Loretto, a boarding school, which was actually quite sort of military in culture. Yes, I was the only Jew there. There were 400 pupils. I was the only Jew right the way through.
Wow. And so were there many then youth opportunities that could kind of help shape you during your childhood? I heard that you were maybe a member of the cadet forces.
Yes, well, so at my second school, at boarding school, I was indeed a member of the cadet forces for about I guess it must have been about 3 or 4 years. It wasn't voluntary, so I can't take any great credit for this. I don't think I was an excellent cadet, although I could probably still strip and reassemble an SA-80 if I had to. We went on parade. We learned to do various things. We went to camps a couple of times. We went to Culty-Bragan camp in Scotland a couple of times. The hardest bit of that actually was must have been my GCSE year, because every year there was the annual general inspection, which was dreaded by everybody, because you basically the entire corps, which was most of the school, so you're talking 300 people, would stand out on one of the playing fields, and we'd be inspected by the headmaster and some visiting army dignitary, a senior army figure. And I can remember one year shortly, and everyone dreaded it because it was like you were standing there for a long time, and people would pass out and stuff. You know, there was stretcher bearers. It was properly they prided themselves on making us stand there all sort of afternoon just to really put you off a career in the military, I think. And everyone dreaded it. And I remember a couple of weeks before, my dad saying to me quite innocently one Sunday I'd gone home, "Do you know who's doing your school annual inspection this year?" And I said, "Oh, it's just some army guy, I don't know." And he said, "No, actually this year it's the Secretary of State for Defence." And I was like, "All right." I thought, "Hang on, that's you?" He said, "Yes, that's me." And I was furious with him because it was like, it was the worst for everyone. It was the worst day of the year. Although actually he was wonderful because he did it because he wasn't interested in how shiny anybody's boots were or how smart they were. And he walked quickly around, and it was over in about half the time. He paused by me and said, as I believe is traditional in military circles, and these when you're sort of inspected by your father, he paused by me and looked at me and said, "I believe I know your mother," and then moved on. So it wasn't so bad in the end.
Wow, pretty interesting experiences. And so then, right back then, did you know that you always wanted to be a journalist? Was it always the dream, or did you have anything else in mind?
I think I probably did, or a writer of some sort. I took at my primary school, I was involved in a kind of sort of little school newspaper for a while, so I obviously enjoyed it. I was sort of brought up to believe that journalists were absolute scum, I must say. So there was a degree of hostility to the idea from my family. I think I always knew I wanted to write. I didn't think I'd end up as being a sort of a newspaper journalist. I sort of most of the early journalism I did was more cultural, music journalism, lifestyle journalism. I wrote for a few magazines and that kind of thing, but I sort of seem to have drifted towards the establishment, sort of pulled by a magnet, I think.
So then obviously you've just spoken about your father, but if we can go back to him, your father, Sir Malcolm, has had an esteemed career, but is also one of AJEX's honorary patrons. So what was it like growing up with such a high profile father?
Well, it's quite hard to say because it was always happening. You know, he was an MP before I was born, and he went into the cabinet when I must have been 7 years old, I think, 7 or 8 years old. No, 9 years old, forgive me, 86. But still, he was in government even before that. So it was kind of normal always being in a situation where everybody knew who my dad was. It was weird in shul, actually, because in shul he was, of course, still surrounded by cousins, and he was one of the younger cousins. So it was kind of like there was a lot of pride in him, but also quite a lot of affectionate mockery. "We Mulkeys come in today," kind of thing. You know, which was always quite interesting. I mean, it gave me what I realized the older I get, the opportunity to have loads of fascinating experiences and meet all kinds of people and go to all kinds of places that really you wouldn't normally experience with a sort of otherwise average middle class Edinburgh childhood. You know, I went to a garden party at Holyrood Palace. I went to Buckingham Palace. I met, you know, I stayed in castles and met visiting dignitaries, and it was sort of, although tedious at the time, in retrospect, I mean, wow, who gets to do that? You know, my own kids certainly don't. So the benefits definitely outweighed the cons.
Amazing experiences. Your grandfather, on your dad's side, I believe, was an air warden in the Second World War. So have you had much of a chance to learn about his experiences there?
I have. He didn't have many. He was my grandfather. He was a salesman. He sold in the sort of the mining villages around Fife. He and his brothers would travel around selling things on credit in the villages around there. And in the war, indeed, he was an air raid warden. Elijah Rifkind was his name, known to everyone as Elkie. Edinburgh didn't have much call for air raid wardens during the Second World War. The alarms did not often go off, and a family legend has it that the one time they did, he was actually asleep, and only heard the all clear and went running out the house to alert everybody without realizing that it was the all clear and everyone was coming back the other way from the shelter. I don't know if this is true. He's not around to ask anymore, but that's certainly what the legend is. But he used to talk about it a bit. You know, he still had his sort of his gas mask in the garage and all that kind of stuff.
So then similarly on your mum's side of the family, your maternal grandfather fled Krakow during the Holocaust and then went on to serve in the RAF. So what can you tell us kind of about him?
So his is this fascinating story that I've only just sort of been piecing together more recently because he'd never really talk about it. He was from Krakow. He was in Warsaw when war broke out, living with his then pregnant girlfriend. And they fled across the battle lines, basically, into Russian-dominated Poland, to Lvov, from where eventually he was deported to far Siberia. And then when Russia changed sides, effectively, you know, in the early 40s, he was given a choice. So we believe, between joining either the Red Army or the RAF, because he was an engineer, and he didn't much fancy joining the Red Army. Not least having because they put him in a gulag for the past 3 years. So he travelled with his wife and then by that point daughter all the way, more or less all the way to Palestine as it then was via Iran, all the way back across Russia, down through what is now Uzbekistan, where his wife and daughter died. And he eventually made it through Iran and Iraq, through to Palestine, and then back to Britain, where he joined the RAF and met my grandmother. So we know he was in the RAF as an engineer. We know he was in the Polish Air Force beforehand. We don't know for certain whether he was in the Polish Air Force before the war or merely during the war. But it's, I mean, you know, his role in the RAF is what brought him to Britain, and is why I'm here.
Incredible. Incredible. So then, to fast forward slightly more to more recent times, you were on Channel 4's SAS Who Dares Wins.
Yes.
So how did you fare in that experience?
Okay, so I wasn't actually on the TV show, I must say. I was dispatched to write about the TV show for the Times magazine, which was basically the same thing, except thank God nobody filmed it, although there are photos which were in the magazine. It was sort of fascinating and terrifying. I'm a relatively, I wasn't as a child, but I'm now a relatively, athletic is the wrong word, but I run a bit and I lift weights and stuff, and I'm in relatively good shape, and I certainly was then, because this was 5 or 6 years ago. Then you come up against three guys. Well, it was two guys from the SBS, one guy from the SAS, and I was their only project for the day. It was 2 days, in fact, and I was abducted in the morning out of my Premier Inn in East Grinstead, which was quite alarming. And it was just basically, I mean, effectively, it was a day of extreme running around with rucksacks and being interrogated and thrown in the boots of cars and what have you. What was interesting about it, at least for me, is I'd expected that I would be, well, it was basically testing both my mental and physical stamina, because of course in special forces, as I'm sure many of your viewers will know far better than me, those are both what are important. And I'd expected, and they'd expected, that my mental stamina would be pretty good and my physical stamina would be appalling. Actually, it was the opposite. I covered a huge distance and jumped off all kinds of cliffs and was thrown into ponds and sort of kept going. I think because I was a bit frightened to stop. But when it came to being interrogated, I was hopeless. So long story short, no, I would not make the cut for the SAS. Surprisingly, turns out. Yeah.
Oh. Stay being a journalist.
Yeah, I think so.
So in the 1930s, AJEX was set up as a response to growing anti-Semitism, and they continue to combat anti-Semitism today. Anti-Semitism has risen hugely in recent months, which is a worry within the community. And you've been very vocal on social media on anti-Semitism. So what do you think is happening, and why, despite what previous generations have fought for, has it raised an ugly head again?
Well, I think, I mean, there may be more, but I always think there are three kinds of anti-Semitism. There is the straight up hatred of difference, which is identical to racism of any other form. Somebody who is different, who is perceived as being different from the norm, is targeted by hatred. That is pervasive and horrendous, but relatively easy to identify and indeed deal with. Then there's your kind of, how to put it, your more informed anti-Semites, your enthusiast anti-Semites who knows a lot about Jews, or feels they know a lot about Jews, and dislikes Jews because they are Jews, and campaigns against Jews because they are Jews. And again, that's more of a problem in, I'd say, the United States with the far right than really in this country. These are often neo-Nazis who believe themselves to be neo-Nazis. These are racists who know they're racists. Again, that's relatively easy to combat, at least for the general population. What we've had, though, in Britain for the last few years, I think, is a third kind of anti-Semitism, which is people who have and hold and exhibit a series of prejudices that they don't realize are about Jews, but all Jews know are about Jews. And I think what's happened with the Labour Party, obviously not all of the Labour Party, but significant bits of the Labour Party, and particularly around the leadership under Jeremy Corbyn, who himself is a very difficult, nuanced figure with all this, because Jeremy Corbyn, of course, resists furiously the idea that he himself might be an anti-Semite, and yet he was always surrounded by anti-Semites that didn't seem to notice. So I think the problem there was a whole swathe of attitudes that were often, but not entirely, about Israel, had sort of pervaded the culture of parts of the left. And Jews recognize this as anti-Semitism, and a lot of other people have been very slow to, I think.
And so is there kind of anything that you would tell the younger generation, like some tools to kind of, for us to arm ourselves with, to kind of counter anti-Semitism?
That's a difficult one. I think people are getting better at recognizing anti-Semitism. I think people are getting better at realizing that it is worthwhile to listen to Jews about anti-Semitism. I thought that, so David Baddiel's approach, David Baddiel recently wrote his book Jews Don't Count, which I know is not to everybody's taste, because David has a very shall we say, difficult relationship with Israel, at least, which I know a lot of you find a bit offensive when it comes from him. Yet his stance is basically to treat that anti-Semitism should be treated exactly like any other sort of racism, not distinct in any other way. Yes, some people say anti-Semitism is punching up and most racism is punching down, and that Jews are white and most racism are largely white at any rate, and most racism is against non-whites. Whereas David says, no, you have to treat anti-Semitism as any other form of racism. And I think for young people, particularly combating anti-Semitism, I think that's a very useful approach, because young people who are not Jewish often have a very, very instinctive understanding of what is and isn't racism these days, and frankly, much better at that than my generation, and certainly than my parents' generation. And I think if young Jews can learn how to help their peers understand that anti-Semitism is exactly like the racisms that they have already identified and object to, then that's probably the best approach.
Thank you. There's a campaign today for AJEX. Why do you think the community should support this great organisation, and how do you think younger generations can continue the legacy of Jewish veterans?
Well, I think it was said very well in the opening video. I mean, what AJEX represents, what Jews in Britain's military represent, is is how intertwined Jews are and always really have been in British life, in mainstream British life. As the son of a cabinet minister, as a Times columnist, I am, of course, intertwined in British life, in the British establishment, in mainstream British life. Jews in Britain are an absolute model of integration. In many cases, that is, Jews represent integration without assimilation, as in Jews have maintained a coherent identity, a coherent religion, coherent traditions, while very much being part of the British mainstream, which I always think is a sort of, I mean, some other minority groups have done it too, but I think Jews did it first and have done it most strikingly, which indeed is why when we were talking about anti-Semitism earlier, a lot of people who express anti-Semitic views don't really comprehend that they're talking about a minority, but they are. But I think if you're talking about the sort of the pinnacle of Jewish integration in British life, really, you do find that in the military, because it is Jews fighting and dying for their country, and their country is this country, which I think is a wonderful thing. So of course everybody should support AJEX on that basis.
Thank you. You're often heard on BBC Radio 4's news quiz. How did you get involved with that, and where do your comedy skills come from?
The last part of that question is very difficult to answer, but I was writing a column in the Times, which I'd put I was always quite funny. I'd put a lot of jokes in, and a producer who I still know quite well, a guy called Ed Morrish, who was a sort of senior comedy producer at the BBC, got in touch with me and said, would you like to come on the show? This was about, I think, 13 or 14 years ago. And I thought, well, I'll give it a go. And I was terrified, really, really frightened. And the first show I did was in Bristol, and I turned up, and Sandy Toksvig, who was hosting it at the time, was very nice to me. And Jeremy Hardy was particularly nice to me. And there was a point early on the first show where I made some joke about having nearly been killed by a giraffe in South Africa, which was true, by the way. And Jeremy Hardy started laughing, and I thought, if I can make Jeremy Hardy laugh, then I'm getting somewhere. Jeremy Hardy was a sort of a renowned comedian on Radio 4. He's quite interesting in the context of this conversation. He was also a fervent pro-Palestine activist, and he died sadly 2 years ago. We had a very close friendship across all kinds of political lines, and he helped me to understand what a lot of people of his sort of politics think they're doing, even if that's not necessarily how it always comes across. So I'll always be grateful for my friendship with him. But no, how I managed to be funny on the radio, no, it's a sort of constant surprise to me too. I think. I mean, lots of members of my family are quite funny. My father is funny. His brother is very funny. There's a sort of a culture of I don't know, sort of sarcastic comments that definitely existed on the pews in shul back when I used to go to shul in Edinburgh. So perhaps it comes from there in some kind of way. But it's the most fun thing you could do in the world is sit on a panel in front of an audience and make people laugh. I miss it enormously. Obviously, for the last year and a half, all kinds of sort of performances have all been Zoom based, as indeed this one is, and it's great, but it's not the same.
No, of course not. So then there's a question that we ask all of our guests, which is, what is next for you, and is there anything that you can tell us?
What's next for me? I'm very lucky. I'm doing my job is I write 3 columns a week in the Times, and I write editorials in the Times, and I do a radio show for the New Times Radio, and I still get to do the news quiz on Radio 4. And so I have the kind of job that I always would have dreamed of having. So I'm a bit scared of saying what happens next in case somebody takes away what's happening already. I would very much like to write another novel. It's been about 18 years since I published a novel, which is horrendous. How can I be old enough that it's 18 years since I published a novel? But I think it is. So that would be nice, although it would be a bit ambitious to say it's necessarily on the cards. As it is, I hope to keep doing more or less what I'm doing for the foreseeable future.
Oh, we look forward to continue seeing you do it.
Thank you.
Finally, these are unprecedented times still, and the physical and mental health, economic and environmental impacts may still affect us all for some time to come. But do you have hope for the future, and what positives do you think may come out of this strange time that we're still living in?
I think we've no question, it's been horrendous. It's been a horrendous year and a half. We can talk about the upsides, but they're vastly outweighed by the downsides. And I don't just mean in terms of sickness and death. I mean in the sort of the trauma of it all, that I think it's hard to recognize because everybody's going through it simultaneously. I mean, I guess in a military context, we've got a lot better lately, although we're still not good enough at understanding and recognizing post-traumatic stress disorder. I wouldn't like to suggest that the things that most people have gone through for the last year and a half have been anything equivalent to that. Yet there has been crisis, an existential crisis that people don't necessarily feel they can turn to anybody about, because literally everybody's going through the same thing. And I think there will be a difficult legacy of that we'll have to come to terms with over a few years. That being said, look, there have obviously been upsides. You know, I've been stuck in a house with my family for a year and a half. We've all, I mean, this has been not without challenges. I have two young daughters, but we all know each other so well. You know, I never spent the kind of time with my parents that I have now spent with my children over the last year and a half. And I don't think we'll forget it. We've come to know each other very well. We've explored our little pocket of London in far more granular detail than I ever thought was possible. I think a lot of us have learned to appreciate the little things closer to home in a way that in sort of hectic lives beforehand we perhaps didn't. And then when you do get the chance to leave your bubble, you know, when you sort of take that trip to another part of the country or even another country, the sheer exhilaration of it reminds you of all the stuff you took for granted before. So I'm hopeful that, firstly, I'm hopeful that this horror will be over quite soon, but I'm also hopeful that we'll approach each other and just the world around us in a slightly different and more appreciative way afterwards.
Well, Hugo, thank you so much for such a wide-ranging and fantastic interview. And I'm going to hand it back over to Fiona for a final word.
Well, thank you for conducting it so well.
Well, that was great. I was muted. There's always something that happens, right? So it's a good way to end, as I was saying, but you couldn't hear. Thank you so much, Hugo and Sydney, for a really fascinating interview and for your time. Thank you, everyone, for watching. And please, lastly, if you haven't already, visit the Charity Extra website and donate to help us to carry on our vital work in remembering, educating, in our welfare work and in combating anti-Semitism. Thank you so much and have a good evening.
Thank you.